Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to the March edition of the Briefing Digital Policy Internet Governance. We didn't expect to have a different format today, but obviously, as you're all aware, the circumstances are different. I'll get back to that in a minute. I just hope that everyone of you is safe and fine, and take care in the days and months to come. This is definitely a completely different environment we're used to. As you know, in the Internet Governance Briefing, Digital Policy Briefings, we usually try to reflect on what has happened in the previous month and what might be coming. It will be a hard task to envisage what will come in the months to come, but we'll give our best. By the way, for all of those that might, for any reason, want to switch off Zoom or might experience problems, there is also a stream on Facebook, live stream, so you can switch if you need to Facebook live stream. We'll pick up some comments from live stream over there as well. Before I start, I would like to introduce my colleagues who will try to cover different aspects of discussion today and make this a little bit of a discussion rather than just a presentation. Natasha, Katarina, Marilia, Sorina, Jovan, and of course, as well as my colleagues Arvin, Marco, and Andriana, who are helping with the setting up of the whole platform, moderating the chat, and then leading us to the regional updates. As always, the sort of outline of the webinar, this discussion is to run through what the events that have happened in the previous month, that means March, to run through the main developments, what we used to call a barometer, then some of the trends, and then finishing with the events that are coming in April, and closing everything with the regional updates. It will be a different format today for a simple reason, as we'll see in a minute, that many of the events have obviously been postponed, that the barometer was not really something that probably makes sense to do in this month. So instead, what we will look into this month is how COVID-19 and the whole disease and pandemic impacted digital policies in the main pillars of digital policy. That means infrastructure, security, human rights, development, social culture issues, economic issues, and emerging technologies, and try to somehow map where we are. We'll now move briefly to the review of the events in March. And it is a little bit like with all the air flights. Many of them have been either postponed or cancelled. There are few which have been shifted actually to the online, and Icon 67 was probably the under the spotlight in March because it was completely done online. They're very experienced with it. It was the first time something as big as Icon meeting was done online. But what we are seeing is that more and more of these events are considering the option. You can see many of them which are postponed, some of them being cancelled, but we are seeing more and more events which are planning to turn into the possibly the online format, which is quite different from the in situ format. We'll look more into the possible April events later in the webinar. But at this point, I wanted to firstly let you know, I'll inform you that in Diplo we have created this Conference Tech Lab, which is sort of a support to everyone who might need support to turn events and developments to online space with all the experience we have in the last 2 decades in the online work, online learning. But I also wanted to pass the floor to Jovan as sort of a Geneva insights. What are the reflections of the diplomatic community and the institutions generally on the crisis today in terms of how do we organize diplomatic life in a way and political life, well, maybe starting from Geneva. Jovan.
Hi, Vlada. Thank you, and it's great to see you. For us at Diplo, it's not complete novelty to have this type of meetings since we have been running online briefings. Vlad, as usual, there are probably 3 key reflections along the Diplo's methodology of covering digital issues: changing environment and mindset in diplomacy, new topics on diplomatic agendas, and new tools. And I'll just briefly reflect without taking too much of your precious time on this. First, I will start with what we are doing today. We are discussing topics on digital policy. You will discuss question of infrastructure, human rights, data, and other issues. This is one important aspect in Geneva. We had a session on human rights. We'll have a session on cybersecurity, and we'll cover this thread of impact of interplay in triangle between crisis, coronavirus crisis, digital issues, and traditional diplomatic issues. Therefore, this is one thread which we'll cover today. Second thread is importance of the digital tools. Therefore, our ConfTech Lab is experimenting with the new tools, mainstreaming that our experience, almost 20 years of experience of delivering online events like this one. What we noticed so far is that there is a difference between what we call it 1 hour and 1 month. You need 1 hour to start, for example, Zoom session like this one. Its entry point is very simple and low, which is very good. But then you need much more experience, organizational, behavioral, procedural, diplomatic, to deliver high quality webinars. This morning we started the course, online course for diplomats, 50 diplomats and officials of international organizations, civil society, on exactly this topic, how to deliver high quality online meetings. Therefore, please follow our Conference Tech Lab and updates on these tools. Therefore, we have a topics, tools, and then we have changing environment. Many people are asking the question, what will happen day after we manage to get rid of or suppress coronavirus? Is the world going to be the same? Is diplomacy going to change? What will be geopolitics and geoeconomics? And on that point, we are starting the series of brainstorming discussions labeled as day after. Therefore, 3 points: new topics on diplomatic agenda, which we'll discuss today, new tools for online conferencing and online learning, and 3, fast changing geopolitical environment for diplomacy. Over to you.
Thank you, Jovan. And while you're there, maybe a quick question back to you. What are the experiences or the buzz in Geneva when it comes to international institutions? Are they managing to switch online? We have seen now that even the Security Council managed to bring some decisions over, I don't know which tool, but it was online. There was a lot of negotiations on how to do that. So are there any experiences to share from the institutions, how they're going to cope with all this?
Yes, the first reaction was adrenaline reaction. There was a Zoom, let's use Zoom and existing tools, Adobe Connect, WebEx. Therefore, there was the adrenaline phase. I see it as a slightly post-adrenaline phase starting this week, maybe, when people started asking questions, what about security? What about privacy, including security of our webinar today, which is a public webinar, therefore it's not concern for us. But for diplomatic services and countries in international organization, it could be one of the major concerns. Second point, which is emerging very fast, what about procedures? Because you have a protocol and procedures, and it has its own function. It's not just invented as sometimes perceived just for the sake of rituals. One has to decide when the particular country is going to speak, on how to put the contribution, on how to make the point of order. Therefore, that element will be emerging more and more as we are conducting more and more meetings online. Therefore, those are 2 points which are basically coming out after adrenaline phase. One is the question of security, and the other is about protocol. On Thursday, we'll host the session between 2 and 3 on business continuity in international Geneva and the global diplomacy. Therefore, we'll tackle some of these issues. Over.
Thank you, Jovan. By the way, a reminder for everyone, those of you that have been to our briefings before, you notice the change of the platform. We have also switched from Adobe to Zoom for the moment. The setting or the layout of the screen might be a little bit different to what some of you might have get to. So you have an option to switch. I think it's the top right corner, a small button to switch to a speaker view, where you will just see the speaker as a big one and the current speaker, and then the others will be listed in case you want to really see our faces while we speak. Okay, moving on to the next part of the webinar, which is, as I mentioned, the barometer that we usually do. We skipped it this time because everything is really in all the media, in all the developments, everything is about coronavirus, about how it impacts the digital life. And as Jovan mentioned, we have we've started this series of webinars, so we'll try to also map at this point some of the key aspects on how the current situation impacts the infrastructure, security, human rights, development, economy. We'll start with the infrastructure. We had a great discussion last week. You can find the summary and the recording of this discussion on our website. But in a nutshell, as we see more and more countries coming into a full or partial lockdown, where citizens are basically spending time back home and being connected through the home rather than to the business networks, we see the unprecedented growth in internet traffic, which is registered on both global and national levels. And there are reports by Verizon and Vodafone of about 20 to 50% of week-over increase. That usually means the peak times and plus the times which are not usual working hours, where we see now new peaks, which is mainly in the evenings when people are not going out and rather streaming the videos or playing the games and so on. Orange said the number of users connecting remotely to it, so the remote connection has increased by 700%. Spanish Telecom reported the IP networks were experiences nearly 40% of increase, and the voice and data usage in mobile networks were up to 50 and 25% respectively. Now, of course, all these measurements are very different. They're measurements of the voice and data through the mobile, a number of connections, peak hours, and so on. So it's hard to compare them. But the general impression is that to some extent the pattern is changing, and there are more stress on some parts of the infrastructure. Going through the infrastructure as it is, we can say that on a local level, that means starting from homes to the, let's say, the flats and so on. We see more throttling because most of the people are staying home and kids are in the e-school or playing games, and the adults are working online using Zoom or VPNs and so on. And what is expected that some local, smaller, sub-regional internet service providers may experience problems. There were reports from Italy, for instance, which is really under big stress, that some of the local ISPs had problems. On the other hand, the big ones, like the Spanish, the French operators have, we're mainly focusing on at this point on Europe because of the situation in Europe currently, where the stress is at the moment the biggest, where Spanish and French operators say that they have sufficient capacity to deal with current internet traffic. Even Telecom Italia says that they can cope with the current surge in traffic, and they have been investing a lot in the past times to build up the infrastructure. Yet again, when we look into the reports from developing countries, for instance, in Nepal, it was assessed that providers do not have appropriate infrastructure to follow the demand, and they might also be dependent in terms of the upstream, the connectivity above or beyond Nepal. They are mainly depending on India and so on. So there is a big question on how the smaller countries which depend on bigger ones and which might have not invested that much for various reasons in the infrastructure, whether they would have any serious problems. That also stays for the national internet exchange points in some places. On the other hand, on a global level, the internet exchange points, mainly Frankfurt, Amsterdam, London, they have also noticed a big surge in the use. But so in matter of percentage, and some of them reported it's about 6 to 7%. But the percent with comparing the amount of traffic that goes through this internet exchange point is huge. These 6-7% can actually equal to a couple of countries bandwidth at the point. But they all are quite confident that they have even 10 times more capacity than currently is in a peak. So they are more or less all of them are very, in a way, happy that they think they're quite certain they can provide the necessary bandwidth. We will see, that's a big remaining question, when the other countries like the US and New Zealand and the others, Australia, maybe get locked, as well as possibly Africa and Asian states and so on. We'll see how things will move, but at the moment we can say, at least on this global level, we are quite safe. When it comes to some of the existing rules, for instance, there was a lot of discussion on possible throttling of the internet by the internet service providers to reach to the quality of service, obviously, and whether some of the specific services should be throttled. In most instances, it was, for instance, BEREC, the European regulator, said that EU net neutrality regulations still are valid, but they will have to go case by case and see whether in some cases there might be a need for a throttling of some services, still equally, treating all the equivalent categories of traffic equally, as on case by case. There is a call by different national authorities to raise awareness among the users, particularly European Commission, the UK, the Serbian, Nepal, and Spain regulators and telecom operators, which are inviting users to behave more smartly or more responsibly, to put down the quality of the streams if they can, and so on. Not to download in the peak hours, and so on. There was also quite an interesting development in the relation between the EU particularly and some of the content providers, in this case Netflix, Facebook, YouTube, Apple, Amazon Prime, and Disney, who basically all took measures to put down the level of the stream, the default level of quality of stream in Europe and elsewhere, in order to lower the bandwidth utilization and in a way prevent the possible congestion because of the high streams and so on. And at the end, we are seeing that more and more of the regulatory authorities are putting up the mechanisms to monitor. So we are seeing, again, BEREC, the European Telecom Regulator Association, they are putting up a sort of a special reporting mechanism to pick the data and react quickly based on the developments on the national level. And the International Telecommunication Union on a global level is establishing a global network resiliency platform, again, to help the governments and private sector to watch on how the crisis develop and possibly come up with some suggestions. But it's more of a monitoring tool. That was in a nutshell on the infrastructure. We'll definitely follow on this in the next months as well. And I would switch now to the part of the infrastructure in a way, which is the emerging technologies, where we're finding quite a lot of use of emerging technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, in the crisis that we see now. So I pass the floor to Sorina to briefly lead us through some of the key developments or impacts of the emerging technologies on digital policies. Sorina.
Thank you, Vlada. Hello, everyone. As Vlada has just said, we've already seen quite a lot of examples of artificial intelligence applications being put to use or developed over the past few months to help in one way or another with dealing with this crisis. We've seen AI-powered scanners deployed to track fever and other symptoms. We've seen machine learning models being developed to predict, for example, protein structures for the virus or help identify symptoms. So there's a lot of AI being put to use, and probably it's all over the place in news articles. But it's not the only emerging technology or advanced technology which is used in this crisis situation. And I'll go quickly through some of the examples of other technologies that are actually being used around the world. So, for example, in Spain, we have the police using drones to monitor cities and urge citizens to respect quarantine rules. And I'm sure this is not the only case where drones are being put to use. We also saw them in China earlier this year. In Italy, 3D printing is used quite intensively, for example, for printing valves, which are used for the ventilators to deal with the traditional supply shortages. Then virtual reality is also used, for example, to see how the virus is affecting lungs and even to help hospitals treat quarantine patients while limiting physical interaction. And last but not least, there is an initiative from major tech companies, including IBM, Microsoft, and Google, also in partnership with several universities and national labs across the US, who have launched what they call a COVID-19 High Performance Consuming Consortium, basically an initiative which is aimed to provide scientists with access to supercomputing resources in an attempt to help them in their research activities. So these are just some examples of how emerging and advanced technologies are used in this time of crisis to help in one way or another. We just wanted to emphasize a bit that it's not only artificial intelligence being used, there's a lot more than just that. And that's it from me quickly. Thank you, Vlada.
Thank you, Sorina. I can only add a number of cases. I'm sure you're all aware of how the 3D printing is actually being used for different masks, ventilators, and other equipment, which is quite an interesting development. I encourage you as well to share, all of you on this meeting, to share your experiences or some good examples of how the emerging technologies are being used in this crisis in your region, country, or what you've heard of. And we can then get back to some of that at the end if there are good, interesting examples. There were a couple of comments on the infrastructure, and thanks for that, particularly on the use of internet exchange points. A good example by Michael Kende from Kenya, Nigeria, and so on, to what extent caching of the local or the content delivery networks, so caching of the content of Google and streams and so on at the local or regional internet exchange points have actually helped reducing the overall internet traffic consumption. Moving on to the security set of developments, basically. In a nutshell, we can say there is not much of a change in the threat landscape in sense of what the load of the attacks. What we can see is the change of the types of attacks, or the focus, or the way, the techniques that people are using. Particularly phishing is something that is being recognized as a big threat. Phishing is an old thing, social engineering thing, but now there are more and more threats which are in some way using the corona-related topics in order to lure people to open the email, to open the attachment, click on the link. There were even some country-specific phishing campaigns, like in Italy. The campaign was in Italian, related to allegedly providing information about the COVID measures and so on, and even pretending to be on behalf of recognized institutions such as the World Health Organization or the National Ministry and so on. So there is a sort of an alert to everyone to be very cautious when it comes to opening the emails that might be related to corona. All the techniques that help us be safe from the phishing emails should be used heavily these days. We've also seen the Europol report on the crime trends during the COVID-19 crisis, and it basically confirms the trend related to exploit of humans. So the humans are, again, the weakest link in terms of the phishing examples. There were some reports on the attacks on the critical health infrastructure. I'll get back to that in a second. There was a report by the tech community and security community that there's a number of corona-related new domains which are created. Some of them legitimately, some of them are basically used for phishing, and there were some cases of the attacks to the DNS of the home routers. Again, switching to some sort of a corona-related bogus websites and domains which host malware. And probably the trivia of this is that also the corona antivirus emerged. Funnily, it is advertised as a way to install the software, and thanks to the advanced AI developments, it can prevent you actually getting corona or disease personally. There is no evidence on how many people installed this software, but there is a clear note: no, corona antivirus cannot fight COVID-19. When it comes to more serious type of threats, we have seen continuous attacks, or even ransomware attacks on the hospitals and healthcare system. It is not new, but it continues, and we have seen the attacks against the hospital in Illinois, the Brno hospital, which is one of the two biggest hospitals there, where some of the COVID tests are done. Some hospitals in Spain, Hammersmith Medicines Research Company, which has been previously working on Ebola vaccines, but now is probably the one to work also on possible tests of COVID-19 vaccine and so on. Interestingly, we have seen the security sector, that means the top professionals of the cybersecurity sector, such as Mikko Hiponen from F-Secure, openly threatening to the ransomware groups to seize these sort of attacks against the hospitals. Otherwise, there will be a harsh response, and as they said, they will track every one of the perpetrators. And the response to Mikko's tweet was an avalanche of support tweets by other security professionals, which completely agreed and offered the support in case it's needed. So that's an interesting sort of a call on war against the ransomware groups that are attacking hospitals in these times. And some of the media managed to come up to, like, Bleeping Computers, to a couple of ransomware groups. Some of them said that they're not going to target hospitals in these times, so there's at least some solidarity. Some of them said that it can happen accidentally, but they'll try to offer free keys if it happens. Some of them said that they are going to continue. So we'll see how this develops. There were a couple of attacks, DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, against the various infrastructures, the US Health and Human Services, the servers of the Croatian academic network CARNET, which were running the e-learning platform. The MyGov portal in Australia went down, and so on. An open question is to what extent it is the DDoS attack that has caused these problems, or to what extent it's simply the increase in pressure in number of connections, so sort of a natural DDoS, and that's something to explore further. And finally, which is also quite an important question when it comes to confidentiality of our data, as we all move online and use the new communication tools like Zoom, we are seeing some of the steps. Last month, we have seen the European Commission, which decided to switch to Signal messaging app and so on. The good question is to what extent our data are confidential anymore, and what are the risks on VPNs and so on. One of the controversies which emerged is just last 2-3 days was the discovery of the Zoom's application for iOS, which shares the data with Facebook, which was not announced to the users. And there is a great discussion, and I saw that some of you also commented on the problems with the Zoom clarity on data management and privacy policies. Zoom responded soon that it will correct the mistake, so that's something we have to see further how it develops. We can get back to that later on, but let's move on to the human rights aspects. And there's a lot of human rights. We also had a webinar on how this crisis impacts the online human rights. But I pass the floor there to my colleague Natasha, who will drive us through the updates on human rights. Natasha.
Thank you, Vlada. So while we have already discussed the infrastructure aspect and how it relates to the coronavirus crisis, one central feature, as Vlada said, that comes into focus is human rights. Today, we could say that we are caught in some sort of limbo of choosing between the basic right to health and all the other rights and freedoms. Perhaps the most concern is being raised over the right to privacy with regards to tracking apps and surveillance systems developed across the world to monitor infected individuals in order to clamp down the spread of COVID-19. For instance, we can see examples in Israel where the government has made headlines when it passed an emergency law that allows security services to track infected persons through mobile data, for instance. And those who are not willingly providing this data to the secret services, well, the secret services can actually take it from them without their approval. Then we have also privacy concerns with regard to text messages sent by the South Korean authorities to individuals that included information on their whereabouts. A slightly less intrusive approach perhaps is being seen in the European Union, where the European Commission has asked mobile operators to share anonymously mobile data in order to help identify patterns in the spread of the coronavirus crisis. We are already seeing these measures being taken in Austria and Germany and Italy, where operators have already started sharing data on their customers with the authorities. The freedom of expression is the second right, human right, that comes into focus. We are seeing a number of countries imposing restrictions on the freedom of the press, for instance, with measures such as suspension of newspaper production and distribution in Jordan, Oman, and Morocco. But we are also seeing laws being enacted in Hungary and South Africa that basically issue prison sentences to those who publish fake news on the COVID crisis. We're also seeing limitations on the freedom of expression from the perspective of censorship of social media platforms. And these limitations are also being seen through internet shutdowns that are perhaps the most rigorous measure out of all. That said, the right to privacy and the freedom of expression are not the only human rights that are being affected. We're also seeing a rise in discrimination, and this has become a concern for many. Misinformation and unproven theories about the spread of the virus actually have led to a number of racist attacks against Asian communities in particular, which all have contributed to the rise in online hate speech, online harassment, and so on. But I think this basically wraps up all the main human rights that are being affected by the coronavirus crisis. Back to you, Vlada.
Thank you, Natasha. Again, there was a very interesting webinar last week that we had with discussions, more in-depth discussions on the human rights, so I invite you to look at that. In the meantime, we received some of the questions mainly based on or looking at the political processes in future. We'll get back to that a little bit later once we run through the topics. Moving on to the economic, probably the most interesting and burning discussions now on economic aspects and the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. And I turn the mic to Marilia. Marilia.
Thank you, Vlada. Well, actually, we can say that this is the flip side of the health crisis that we're facing now. So much so that some countries are being confronted with making hard choices. Brazil, for instance, there hasn't been really an alignment between different parts of the governments to enact policies of confinement because they believe that the economic crisis in the country will be so big that it doesn't justify to put different businesses and the society as a whole under confinement. So indeed, it is very concerning, the world that we will face when the crisis has passed and how this will affect businesses and jobs everywhere. I would recommend, if people want to see some advice that is being given to businesses, I would recommend you to follow the reports that have been published by McKinsey. McKinsey has followed the crisis very closely, trying to draw scenarios and to make sure that business people understand what is to come. And they say that we need to keep in mind 5 R's. The first of them is resolve. So we need to resolve whatever is the big challenge of the moment. So keep people alive, inject money on the economy. We need to build resilience for the future. So long time, perhaps help that will be needed to keep the economy running. We need to devise a plan to return back to normal, and this need to be thought now. What are the sectors that need to come back first? So we need to see how we can bounce back from the crisis. We need to reimagine what will be the new normal, because this is a moment of discontinuation. And of course, it will create a lot of opportunities as well to reinvent businesses and new ways of doing things. And we need to reform. So there will be regulatory reforms that will need to be put in place, and perhaps a new way to conceive environmental policies, because many people also see a close connection between destruction of natural habitats and what we see in terms of proliferation of viruses. But focusing on the digital economy, I believe that the impact on the digital economy has been quite uneven. We have seen, for instance, startups that have started to gain prominence because they are developing products to help to fight the crisis. Artificial intelligence, like we saw, what Sorina mentioned, is an example. But robotics as well. There are robots that are being deployed to clean and disinfect our hospitals, for example. But it depends on the sector, so it varies a lot. So sectors such as fitness and robotics and artificial intelligence, SMEs and startups have received a lot of injection of resources and money, but there are other sectors in which companies are really losing ground. And just think about booking services, transportation. Big companies such as Uber and Booking.com and Lyft, they are not being immune with regards to the crisis. And there have been, of course, losses. Uber came forward to see that they do have the buffer to face the crisis. So they're trying to make sure that investors are appeased. But these companies have faced lots of losses. Uber started by having a very stark response to the crisis, trying to say that they will discontinue the profile or suspend temporarily the profile of drivers that came into contact with people that have been contaminated by COVID-19. But that hard stance was heavily criticized. So now the company is taking a position of trying to make sure that they support the drivers more. So if drivers prove that they have been contaminated or they have been asked by a medical authority to stay home, then the company will pay the driver for 14 days to stay home. Many people say that this is insufficient. Of course, many of the people that are contaminated, they are not tested. So they cannot prove to the company that they are carrying the virus, but they are trying to respond in a more PR way and try to act more responsibly. The after crisis will also bring perhaps some changes when it comes to the power of big companies and big platforms. What is being forecasted is that we have a few platforms that are so powerful and they have such a big buffer of cash that they could even take advantage of the crisis to grow even more. Just think about the Silicon Valley big companies that have the money to continue investing on innovation while other companies will need to cut down. And perhaps this will even create a new wave of buying, mergings, acquisitions that will bring even more concentration to the digital economy. And this is really something of concern for the future. Authorities have been gaining ground when it comes to trying to enforce competition on the digital economy, but maybe after the crisis, they will be too busy trying to make sure that everyone has jobs, for instance, and to continue on this track of trying to make the digital economy more competitive. And therefore, we need to see there will be winners and losers on the digital sector, but there is a tendency that perhaps the current winners will win even more after the crisis have passed. Let's not forget they do have a lot of data on their hands, even to predict, sometimes make predictions on when the crisis will be over or when will be the best moment to invest or to sell their actions, just like Jeff Bezos did just before the crisis. So there's a lot of moving parts still that we will need to observe. But I think that what stays with us is that government has been very important, economically speaking, to respond to this crisis. And they will continue to be important after the crisis in areas such as consumer protection, which became super important during the COVID-19 crisis. There's a lot of concerns with regards to contracts that cannot be observed during the crisis. There's a lot of fake news about miraculous medicines being put in place online. So governments have been more proactive. The question is how this balance between companies and governments will come out of the crisis. So how this balance will be affected by the crisis now, and what is the scenario that we will face after the crisis. Over to you, Vlada.
Thank you, Marilia. And I guess it's worth noting that some new businesses emerged, or have grown, such as Zoom. I guess there will be space for specific online industries that might actually grow, as you mentioned, in these times, not just the giants. And it's interesting to observe that there were some cases of, not sure about Uber, but I know about some local similar companies, like also here in Serbia, who have actually given their vehicles and drivers to help volunteers bring the food around the city for free and so on. So we can hope that some of the companies can actually play an important role in supporting the crisis to some extent. Okay, there was a lot of questions and comments, and thank you for great discussion. I'm trying to follow in vivo, but I see Jovan and the others are active, so we'll get back to some of the key points from the discussion soon. Let's move to the social cultural aspects. A lot of issues about content policy, digital identity, and so on. So I'm passing the floor to Katarina.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. The COVID-19 pandemic has had an unprecedented impact on society, shifting our day-to-day activities from offline to the online arena. As expected, misinformation covered under the content policy has taken the lead in the sociocultural basket. Since the virus outbreak, major social media companies have tried to curb misinformation. Instagram, for instance, said it would remove coronavirus-related content and accounts from recommendations in its Explore option, unless the content belongs to a credible health organization. On the other hand, Twitter barred users from posting misleading information about the new cases, coronavirus cases. Earlier this month, Facebook announced that it would give the WHO as many free ads as they need to respond to the coronavirus outbreak, whereas WhatsApp recently launched the WhatsApp Coronavirus Information Hub that offers, amongst others, general tips and resources for users to reduce the spread of disinformation and find accurate health information. At the national level, for instance, in the UK, a specialist unit has been set up by ministers to counter disinformation about coronavirus, whereas in the EU, the Rapid Alert System, an EU tool for monitoring disinformation, has been put into use as a response to a growing number of disinformation campaigns on the coronavirus outbreak. Misinformation has also been addressed by world leaders. Russia's President Vladimir Putin claimed that Russia has been targeted by misinformation about the coronavirus organized from abroad to sow panic. In the US, President Trump's administration claimed that there was a, as they said, deliberate effort by a foreign entity to sow fears of a nationwide quarantine. Another issue was gained in prominence, and this is digital identity, as governments across the globe are increasingly relying on the use of citizens' digital identities. In the United Arab Emirates, the government encourages citizens to use digital identity for accessing government services remotely. Moreover, demand in online ID verifications has spiked since the outbreak of the virus. Passbase and Onfido are among the digital identity startups that have experienced a steady increase in demands, especially from the healthcare sector. Lastly, online education became a heated topic as schools in most of the countries have gone digital. Italy was among the first countries to shut schools. Beginning of March, the Ministry of Education has called on schools directors to activate distance teaching methods with particular attention to the specific needs of people with disabilities. A number of countries, for example, United Arab Emirates, Japan, or Egypt, have provided students with free access to online learning platforms during the pandemic. And shifting from predominantly offline to a completely online learning environment poses a challenge to many countries. To that end, Estonia's Ministry of Education has decided to share its online learning tools and expertise to educational facilities in countries that are affected by school closure. At the international level, UNESCO has established the Global Education Coalition for Coronavirus Response to provide advice and technical assistance to governments that are working in securing educations for all the students in affected areas. That's all from my end. Over to you, Vlada, and stay safe.
Thank you, Katarina. I've noticed the update, I think it was this morning, that also both Facebook and who else was there withdrew the comments of Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, after Twitter did it, where he was actually, according to them, not in a way misbehaving in times of crisis, where he was neglecting the measures and all of that. So it's an interesting shift in the companies which are now blocking the content of even the high-level politicians if it is not in line with the corona measures in a way, or anti-corona measures. Okay, moving on to the last topic in this review, which is a development aspect. And thank you, Torbjörn, for sharing the information about the UN call for 2.5 trillion crisis package for developing countries. The good question is to what extent also digital aspects will be covered in that. We have discussed in the infrastructure part, for instance, that there is a lot that needs to be done to boost the readiness of the internet service provider, exchange points, and so on. But that's something probably to look into. Passing the floor back to Natasha to quickly run us through the development aspects, and then we can reflect some of the questions. Natasha.
Thank you, Vlada. I will try to be quick, given that we are limited on time. Basically, my colleagues more or less touched upon different aspects that relate to development. However, I would like to focus on two key points, that is digital divides and climate change. I already saw that in the chat, digital divide was being discussed. So we already mentioned that the shift online has led to a rise in distance learning and teleworking. However, this has also brought into focus the issue of digital divides. While social distancing measures might seem logical in times of crisis, we can't forget about the 46% of the world's population who lack access to the internet. In order to address these digital divides, in other words, the gaps between those who have access to the internet and those who do not, organizations like Google and Telecom, for instance, in Kenya, teamed up in order to provide 4G through Google balloons and ensure that communities, in particular the youth, have access to the internet so that they can continue their schooling online. That said, divides are not only visible in the North and South dynamics, they're also present within the developed world. And we see that vulnerable communities that do not have access to the internet and technological equipment are particularly affected. For instance, 46% of lower income households in the United States do not have a personal computer and as such cannot work or study from home. More attention is also being paid to the corporate digital divide. We have seen the recent reports of a record 3.3 million people filing for unemployment in the United States. So we are seeing that those businesses that have not or cannot transition online have been impacted by the rapid shift to online tools. The second point from the development perspective that I would like to address is climate change. We have all seen that the coronavirus has reduced greenhouse gas emissions and has improved air quality in China, South Korea, Italy, and the United States. The World Meteorological Organization said that the measures, that the current situation is by no means a reflection of the climate action, and as such, obviously should not be a replacement for climate action. The coronavirus has been also dubbed as the green virus. However, the rapid transition to teleworking, to online conferencing, to online learning is far from being environmentally benign. We know that digital pollution is often referred to as hidden or invisible pollution that basically refers to greenhouse gases emitted from by the use of internet, massive data centers, but also emerging technologies like Bitcoin mining. And these all account to 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which exceeds, for instance, the emission of the aviation industry. We're also seeing a digitalization of climate change activism, with calls from climate change activist Greta Thunberg to engage in digital strikes so as to avoid the spread of the virus. That would be all this time for the development basket. Thank you, Vlada.
Thank you, Natasha. And with a caveat that the development is basically a cross-cutting issue of everything that we've discussed, and in every of the other was a sort of a development aspect as well. There were a couple of good discussions. I just wanted to quickly close this chapter of the briefing before passing the floor also to Jovan to respond to some of the interesting questions. Let's move on to just see what was planned in April, at least as a rough plan of the events of April. And as we can see again, most of them have been cancelled, but they are more and more like the ARIN meeting and the World IP Day that are shifting to online. We hope to see more and more of that. I'm glad to hear also, I think it was Torbjörn mentioning that the e-commerce week will shift or change the format to some extent into a set of webinars and so on. So we hope to see more and more of the online events rather than cancelled and postponed, because we still don't know how long it's going to take to recover from this. And moving to the last sort of a slide of this discussion is the plan of Geneva Internet Platform. You can expect the Digital Watch newsletter with basically a summary of most of these issues and some other interesting bits to come up in the next days, so stay tuned. And then there are a couple of course, all of them are online now, webinar discussions, how to boost how to ensure that the business community in a global diplomacy. Then the debate on multilateral diplomacy in times of COVID, that's going to be very interesting. Cybersecurity in time of crisis, the focus on how this crisis is impacting cybersecurity. And then the road to Bern via Geneva is basically a dialogue on data protection, support of the road to Bern process, but again, online. And finally, the next briefing at the end of April. Before we move to the regional updates, and there are quite some interesting bits in the regional updates as well, I wanted to use to do the quick summary of your points over there, and to the extent I couldn't follow much. Marco was really helping me to get the bits. There were a couple of interesting discussion threads. One was related to this support packages to developing countries, and the question was to what extent the digital divide aspects would be included in that, and also to what extent there will be rather a reaction or fighting in sense of the crisis, or to what extent it could be visionary and the longer-term support to avoid or be more prepared for this type of crisis. And then Richard had also one of the comments that it will be interesting to observe whether the governments themselves will look more into getting ready for this sort of crisis rather than just responding. There was a good set of discussions or comments on the online learning in developing countries, particularly Nigeria, where Rufa mentioned that the government schools were simply closed, and there were a couple of questions on whether that has to be that way, whether kids do have options for connectivity and devices, and it will be interesting to share the views and experiences from other countries as well, how the e-schools, or whether they are e-schools, and whether that can work. I'll just finish this with a couple of questions that went mainly on the future of political process in a way. There was a question from Nigel whether, or it was Richard, whether the governance in general will be affected, whether the multi-stakeholder governance will be affected, or the multi-stakeholder processes will be affected with this shift to online, or in general shift. Then there was again the question on broader divides in terms of digital readiness that this crisis brings, and then the last one from Sandrine, that the main problems using the new tools in multilateralism is also practical ones, translation, number of participants, and so on and so forth. So I pass the floor quickly to Jovan, if you wish to reflect on any of those, because you've been following the discussion quite closely and responding. So if you have any reflections on any of those, Jovan.
Thank you, Vlada. Just a few practical points. We are currently discussing with, for example, human rights community to bring together main actors and NGOs and the governments, and to co-organize webinars, because there is a risk that we'll have inflation of online communication. We are hearing already from our tech attaché community that they feel that they're overloaded, and the fact that they work from home doesn't reduce the load. Therefore, there is a risk of inflation of events, because most organizations will be moving online. Therefore, that's on human rights. Maybe we can do something similar for economic development, cybersecurity community, to make a fewer conversations, but on a higher level in terms of preparations, insights, debates, background documents. This is the first point. Second point, on Thursday, we are having that discussion on business continuity of international Geneva and global diplomacy. And some of the issues like interpretation, preparation, participation of developing countries will be addressed. And this is ongoing discussion, which we have been having in Geneva on the way how we adjust to new normal. And third point, there is a preparation for these discussions about day after. With some foresight techniques, with the data analysis, there will be use of AI for the simulation development of the simulated scenarios. Therefore, stay tuned, stay safe, first of all, and stay tuned for the new things that will be coming from Geneva on all of this, both practical and I would say also conceptual or even philosophical aspects. Over to you.
Thank you, and probably a good summary of this was well put by Amina in the chat. My hope is that our new normal today exposes what was wrong with our old normal yesterday and sets up for the better normal tomorrow. So probably a good summary of this. Moving on to a couple of regional updates, very interesting bits from the regions. So stay with us on that one. I'm passing the floor to my colleague Andreana, who will lead us to the regional updates.
Thank you, Vlada. As we're running short on time, I will just jump right into it. First off, we'll have Amrita Chowdhury from Asia. Amrita will tell us about how governments in Asia are fighting off fake news and misinformation regarding COVID-19, and also how governments are shifting to telemedicine. Amrita, over to you.
Hello and welcome to the regional update from Asia for the month of March. Most of the Asian countries have been affected by the coronavirus, and the interplay of technology and health to fight the spread of this virus is very evident. With a surge of fake news and misinformation being spread on the coronavirus over social media, the Ministry of Electronics and IT, Government of India, has issued an advisory for social media companies to initiate awareness campaigns on their platform against such false news, take immediate action and disable or remove such content on priority, and disseminate authentic information related to coronavirus. Platforms on their part have initiated some steps. Instagram will only show resources from WHO, Center for Disease Control, and local health authorities when anyone taps the hashtag related to COVID-19. Facebook to remove all posts which claim conspiracy theories and false claims about the virus that has been flagged by global health organizations and local health authorities, and Twitter to remove tweets that can cause harm by spreading misinformation about the virus. With movement being restricted, various countries are resorting to online health consultation and telemedicine. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, announced the launch of free online health consultation services. The Australian federal government announced that telehealth services such as video conferencing would be provided, and India issued telemedicine guidelines for online health consultation. That's all from Asia for this month. Thank you and stay safe.
Thank you, Amrita. Next up, we have Grace Mutungu from Africa. Grace will give us 4 updates from the region, all related to COVID, unfortunately. First of all, she will tell us about events being cancelled, then about efforts for cashless payments to curb the spread of corona, then MTN reducing its charges to help people communicate better, and some new free TV channels for people to be informed about the spread of the virus. Grace, over to you.
Welcome to Updates from Africa, March 2020. It's of course been a difficult month in the wake of the coronavirus. We've seen some events being cancelled, for example, the ID4D Africa, which is, I guess, the largest digital ID forum that brings together governments, vendors, and other actors in the digital ID space, has been postponed to October. Also, the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum that was to take place at the end of April has now been postponed to a date to be announced later. We've witnessed a lot of action from governments. We've seen the central banks of Ghana and Kenya, for example, giving directives to lower mobile money transaction charges and also to increase the wallets of mobile money wallets so that people can have cashless transactions and therefore reduce the chances of the virus spreading through cash. We've also seen mobile network operator MTN, which operates in a lot of countries in the continent, reducing a lot of its charges in order to make it easier for people during this time. They are also opening up their social networking app called Yellow. It's going to be free for subscribers in Nigeria and South Africa. The satellite television company DSTV is opening up news channels for free for even non-subscribers all over the continent. This is to enable people to keep up with the news as countries battle with the virus. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. We now go to the Middle East and North Africa, where Hanan will be informing us about the impact that COVID-19 had on e-commerce and trade and online learning in the region. Go ahead, Hanan, please.
Good morning. My name is Hanan Boujami, and I'm bringing to you Diplo briefing for the month of March 2020 from the Middle East and North Africa. This month, the briefing will be focused on the outbreak of COVID-19. So the current circumstances made it possible finally for the technology to be at the center of concern of governments and different institutions, because the shift to online work and education is the main concern at the moment, to make sure that business and learning carries on. So to start with, the impact on the use of e-commerce platforms has increased significantly in the context of the Middle East, and specifically applications or startups which are offering delivery services for food and groceries, since people are practicing social distancing. So this phenomenon has taken over a number of countries in the region, including Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Tunisia, Egypt, and Oman. So these startups now use technology as a principal tool to run their activities, and that definitely has shifted the uptake of e-commerce in the region. On another note, Google also is deploying several tools to help the educational system cope with the demand of the shift to online learning. So last week, Google rolled out a free access to advanced Hangouts, which includes different tools like video conferencing. It has high bandwidth capabilities. So the teach from home option is now a central hub of information, and it includes tips and trainings and tools from across Google for educational help. And this project was rolled out initially with the UNESCO, the Institute of Information Technologies and Education, who are also working on other educational with other educational partners to respond to this emergency. The YouTube Learning destination is also another hub, which includes high quality learning material designed for students in the Middle East, and it's delivered in Arabic. It includes key subjects like mathematics, physics, English, Arabic, biology, and chemistry. So these tools and different platforms hopefully will help the region cope better with the outbreak of COVID-19. That's all from me. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thank you, Hanan. At the end, we will hear from Wanda Perez. Interestingly enough, the updates from the Caribbean region, which will be given by Wanda, are not centered around the COVID-19 crisis. Wanda will tell us about the launch of the Caribbean Development Foundation, and then a new partnership to trade digital assets, and the creation of LACNIC's new CSERT. Wanda, over to you.
My fellows, I hope that all of you are safe with the war confronting COVID-19 pandemic. 3 major developments to share in our Caribbean region. First, the Caribbean Telecommunication Union launched the Caribbean Internet Development Foundation, CIDF, a not-for-profit organization to facilitate a new approach for addressing Caribbean internet governance and digital transformation issues. CIDF pursues to implement national projects to build capacity, develop internet infrastructure, mobilize communities of interest, train stakeholders to execute specific programs for improving organizational efficiency, security, and productivity, facilitating digital transformation and the growth of a digital economy. The second update is related with the Eastern Caribbean Securities Exchange and Block Station, who partnered to pilot the trading of digital assets. The Block Station platform facilitates access to international investors by permitting the use of Bitcoin and Ether in addition to fiat currencies. This enables smaller investors to participate in exciting offering due to the low cost of blockchain transactions. And the last one was the announcements made by the Internet Address Registry for Latin America and the Caribbean, LACNIC, about the creation of its Computer Security Incident Response Team, CSIRT. CSIRT, LACNIC, will be a coordination hub for cybersecurity incidents within its region and will try to help mitigate their potential effects. It will also work to strengthen regional professionals' understanding of computer security incidents. Thank you very much. Stay healthy, stay safe.
Thank you, Wanda. And once again, thank you for sharing all your updates, Amrita, Grace, Hanan, and Wanda. Vlada, at this point, I will give the floor back to you for closing.
Thank you, Adriana. And I can only hope that in the next iterations of the briefing, we'll switch to non-COVID topics more and more. Hopefully we've seen some of the articles in Financial Times on the new internet and so on. Let's see whether we're going to reflect more on that in the next meetings. As for the closure, well, special thanks to all of you that have supported this briefing, and Rana, Jovan, Sorina, Natasha, Katarina, Marilia, and then behind the scenes, Arvin and Fire, and Marco, who has been helping with the remote moderation. I remind you that there is the new edition of the Geneva Digital Watch newsletter will be available for download on the Observatory Digital Watch in the next few days. So dig.watch/newsletter, and then see you or ECU on the 28th of April for the April meeting of the briefing. And as Wanda would say, stay safe. And for all of those that might have been affected, including Vint Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet, well, we hope you'll all recover very soon. Thank you, and see you on 28th of April. Bye-bye.